Okay, here we are all the way in the 1960s. I've chosen these images to sort of symbolize the 60s because the pictures, it's actually a group of four pictures put into one picture, one graphic image. On the left show films that were released in the 1960s, from the uplifting musical song Sound of Music to the fashion icon Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. But also, remember, the 60s included some very disturbing films. Psycho, this one showing Janet Leigh screaming in the shower as she's about to be stabbed by her killer, was really quite shocking. And it's a Hitchcock movie, really quite shocking in American consciousness, and sort of broke new ground in terms of what was written and directed in Hollywood from then on. And then on the right here, finally, 1964 or 5, I think, To Kill a Mockingbird by, which is a novel by Harper Lee, but made into a movie starring Gregory Peck, considered one of the greatest courtroom dramas of all time and one of the greatest American films dealing with racism of all time. Okay, I recommend all of them for those different reasons. Watching them not only for the entertainment value, I suppose, but mainly for the fact that they were all made in the '60s and they all had very different purposes and very different messages. And then on the right we have just a group of protesters in the late '60s. I think this is '68, showing, and I chose this one. There were, there are of course a billion pictures of protesters available on Google or whatever, but this one has a number of different issues: racism, Vietnam, all that sort of thing. So I think that's very important to show that it was, there were a lot of things that were on young people's mind, especially. Okay, you'll notice almost all the people in this crowd are young people, all your age, an awful lot of college students, but not only college students. Okay, and as we'll see later on, like we saw in the last lecture, there are people who protest against these things, pro-Vietnam people, pro-segregationists, things like that. So it's not always just one way. I just thought that these pictures are very interesting to symbolize what I'm going to talk about over these next two lectures. And here's what I'm going to talk about over these next two lectures: the Civil Rights Revolution, the Kennedy years, LBJ's presidency, the changing black movement, Vietnam, and the New Left, new movements, and the rights revolution, and especially the crucial year of 1968, which is an amazing year. It's amazing that the country lived through it. Now, if I talk about the Civil Rights Revolution, the focus question could be, or should be, what are the major events in the civil rights movement of the early 1960s? And I think that it's fair to say this is a high tide of protest. Okay, and it's also fair to say that through sit-ins and other things, college students became the leading force for social change. Okay, in 1960, young black activists, along with a few whites in Raleigh, North Carolina, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC, which would work to replace segregation with something called a beloved community of racial justice and give African Americans control over decisions that affected their lives. Direct action of many kinds followed these sit-ins. African Americans demanded access to segregated beaches, to segregated pools, especially in Florida. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, C-O-R-E, launched the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups traveled on buses into the Deep South to force compliance with court orders banning segregation in interstate transportation. Now, violent mobs attacked them and burned the buses while police stood by. These were called Freedom Rides. Okay, and eventually they forced federal desegregation of interstate transportation, despite, of course, numerous arrests of activists. Escalating protests saw growing resistance from local authorities. In late 1961, SNCC and other groups began a nonviolent campaign against racial discrimination in Albany, Georgia. That protest lasted a year, and demonstrators filling the jails unfortunately failed to win national sympathy. Okay, it went on for a long time, and frankly, many Americans in other parts of the country got tired of hearing about it. In late 1962, a court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, an African-American student. State police did nothing as a mob, encouraged by the state's governor, rioted. 2 people were killed, and President Kennedy had to dispatch Army troops to restore order. And I've put in your folder for this module JFK's famous Civil Rights Act speech, Civil Rights Bill speech, I should say. He didn't pass it, about this, which was prompted by this as sort of the last straw. Okay. Protests crested in 1963 as demonstrators protested against inequalities in education, inequalities in employment, inequalities in housing, and these protests spread throughout the South. In 1 week in June, more than 15,000 people were arrested in 186 cities. This wave of discontent culminated in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a deep South city with a history of violence against blacks since World War II. When local blacks protesting for more economic opportunity and the desegregation of local businesses had little success, Martin Luther King Jr. came to the city. While in jail for violating a ban on demonstration, King wrote his eloquent Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was published widely, especially in the North. King excoriated local clergy who asked for patience and recounted the daily abuses that black Southerners face. He asked white moderates to abandon fears of disorder and commit themselves to racial justice. When King decided to have black school children join the protest, the city's police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered brutal attacks with nightsticks, fire hoses, and attack dogs. And the thing was, television images of this sort of repression outraged national and world opinion and led Kennedy finally to embrace the civil rights movement's goals. He'd been very moderate when it came to civil rights before this. He certainly talked about it rhetorically, but never did anything until this happened. Leading businessmen in Birmingham, fearing damage to the city's reputation, ended the protest by desegregating stores and restaurants and promising to hire African American people. The Birmingham riots and the Birmingham situation, the Birmingham reaction, forced white Americans to decide whether they had more in common with citizens demanding basic rights or more in common with violent segregationists. And the assassination of Medgar Evers, who was an NAACP official in Mississippi, and the bombing of a black church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls later in 1963 made the question much more pointed. On August 28th, 1963, 250,000 black and white Americans participated in the March on Washington, considered many to be the high point of the civil rights movement. This was organized by a coalition of civil rights leaders, labor leaders, church groups. It was the largest protest in American history up until that time. It called for jobs and freedom, and the marchers also called for passage of a civil rights bill in Congress, also a public works program to fight unemployment, minimum wage increase, and a law barring discrimination in employment. On the Lincoln Memorial steps, Martin Luther King said his most famous words in what is now known as the "I Have a Dream" speech. And while the march showed the movement's potential, including unity between blacks and whites, it also showed the movement's limits. All the speakers were male, despite the critical role of women in the movement. Organizers also pressed SNCC leader, as Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader John Lewis, who just died a couple of years ago, to remove militant messages from his speech. Civil rights activists resurrected the Civil War era vision of the federal government as the custodian of American freedom, despite the decades-long promotion of segregation. However, black activists had a historical reason to turn to national authorities rather than state and local offices, but it remained unclear whether the federal government would take up this responsibility. These are participants in a sit-in in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. The protesters were students from a local college, and they brought books and newspapers with them to emphasize the seriousness of their intentions and their commitment to nonviolence. This is a lunch counter in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you can see they're not being served. The waitresses in the background refuse to serve them, and these sit-ins, which have been going on since the 50s, mid 50s anyway, really accelerated in the 1960s. It became a very prominent way for protesters to demonstrate against segregation. And these are protesters, civil rights demonstrators in Orangeburg, South Carolina in 1960. Again, please note that it was very important for the civil rights movement, and the civil rights leaders were absolutely strict in their demands that the protesters always dress as well as they could, that they do not wear work clothes, that they do not wear, farming clothes or factory clothes or anything like that, as much as possible to wear their jackets and ties and their dresses and things that they would wear on, if not formal occasions, but certainly dress as well as they could. And of course, a lot of these protesters were office workers and things like that. So it's not as if, the only civil rights protesters were people who worked farms and just wore their Sunday best at protests. But it was very clear that from the NAACP that they wanted to make sure to project the best possible image. Here we see a climactic demonstration in Birmingham where firemen assaulted young African Americans with high-pressure hoses. Now, this was broadcast on television. One of the reasons that the picture is not as clear as it should be. Now, notice that the protesters are trying to hold hands to stay together, but the fire hoses were knocking them over. So these pictures posed a serious problem for the U.S. in the battle for hearts and minds against communist countries in the world, and forced the Kennedy administration to confront the contradiction between the rhetoric of freedom on the one hand and the reality of racism on the other. The administration was going around the world preaching American freedom and American ideals of freedom, American as a model of freedom, and yet these pictures were shown everywhere. Here's a picture of three participants in the 1963 March on Washington as they stand in front of the White House with signs invoking freedom and the memory of slavery. You can't see them because they're really upside down, but the signs are upside down. But they're at the White House there. Okay, now I should move on to the Kennedy years, and the keys here are what were the keys to focus on, or what were the major crises and policy initiatives of the Kennedy administration. And don't think just because we've gone into the 1960s that we've left the Cold War behind, because we haven't, right? The Cold War went on until 1989. And although JFK was president in total only for 3 years, and he accomplished really very little in domestic affairs. LBJ ended up doing all the hard lifting and putting through all the bills that Kennedy wanted to get through. The Kennedy administration, even though I guess says they've accomplished little in domestic affairs, it's now seen as a time of high hopes and U.S. world leadership. In his inaugural address, Kennedy promised that a new generation of Americans would, quote, pay any price, bear any burden to, quote, assure the survival and success of liberty. He was seeming to ask Americans to transcend 1950s consumerism and sacrifice for the common good. Okay. But again, Kennedy more or less ignored the growing civil rights movement and focused on his main interest, which is the fighting the Cold War. You'll notice that that one of the YouTube videos that I put up in the module has Kennedy's civil rights speech of 1963. Well, he'd been president for already 2.5 years by then, so it's important to note that he didn't make that civil rights speech in 1961. He made it in 1963. Kennedy tried to increase U.S. influence and check communist power in the world with several programs, including the Peace Corps, which sent young Americans to assist economic and educational work in developing nations, and the space program that would send Americans to the moon after the Soviets first launched a satellite carrying the first man into orbit around the Earth. But that of course happens in 1963, and LBJ, the vice president under Kennedy, and then president from 1964 onwards, was really the person who again did all the heavy lifting and got all that work done. Kennedy also formed a new Latin American policy called the Alliance for Progress. It was kind of a smaller Marshall Plan for the region that would fight poverty and challenge communism. But military regimes and local elites controlled and took most of the alliance funds, and few Latin America's poor actually benefited from the Alliance for Progress. Okay, a lot of these things it's not necessarily that Kennedy was abandoning people after giving these rhetorical promises, but that the programs were harder to fulfill on the ground than the promises were to make on the airwaves and in speeches at the United Nations. Okay. Like Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy saw the world through a Cold War lens. He's a vigorous Cold Warrior, including events in Cuba. See, in 1959, Fidel Castro successfully led forces that overthrew the regime of the Cuban dictator Batista. Under Batista, Cuba had been an economic dependency of the United States, and when Castro's government started to nationalize Americans' lands and investments and sell sugar to the Soviet Union, Eisenhower stopped trade with the island, and the CIA began to train anti-Castro exiles for an invasion. Then Kennedy was elected to office, and in April 1961, he let the CIA invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Now, this invasion was a colossal failure, and it pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and Kennedy's administration then went on and tried assassinations and other tactics to get rid of Castro, but failed. This was a big black eye for the Kennedy administration on the international scene. And in fact, relations between the U.S. and the USSR worsened. In August 1961, in order to deter immigrants fleeing from East to West Berlin, the Soviets built a wall separating two parts of the city. Until its demolition in 1989, the Berlin Wall symbolized the Cold War and the division of Europe. But a far more serious crisis, or more dangerous crisis, especially for the U.S., developed in Cuba in October 1962, when U.S. spy planes discovered that the Soviets were installing missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to U.S. targets. Now, the Soviets' motives are still unclear, but the Kennedy administration refused to accept the missiles' presence. Now, having been burned with the advice he got about the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy rejected military advice to invade Cuba. Likely that would have triggered a Soviet attack, not only in maybe Cuba itself, but perhaps in Berlin, and maybe even a nuclear war. So instead, the idea was to impose a blockade or a quarantine of the island, okay, and demand the missiles' removal. Very tense behind-the-scenes negotiations led the Soviet Premier Khrushchev to withdraw the missiles in exchange for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to secretly remove its missiles from Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for 13 days, the world was on the brink of total nuclear war, and the crisis diminished Kennedy's Cold War enthusiasm. Okay. Kennedy began to see that things were much more complicated than the good versus bad rhetoric he had been championing especially in the election of 1960, and so he became less of an ardent Cold Warrior. And by the way, in the next year, 63, he tried to reduce tensions by appealing for more cooperation. And in that year, 1963, the U.S. and the USSR agreed to a treaty banning nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere and in space. This was by far the most important achievement of the Kennedy administration. In fact, you might argue it was really the only achievement of the Kennedy administration. And in 1963, the civil rights began to distract Kennedy from the Cold War. He'd been reluctant, as I said, to support the demands of African Americans, and he seemed to share the fears of J. Edgar Hoover from the FBI that the movement was inspired by communism. Kennedy waited until 1962 to ban discrimination in federal housing, which is a promise he'd made in the 1960 campaign. He used force only when federal law was blatantly violated. Okay, but he did not protect civil rights workers from violence, insisting that law enforcement was a local responsibility. This was a very, very difficult thing to juggle. Pushing civil rights enough, but yet relying that if you didn't placate local opinion, you would have another civil war on your hands. Finally, the Birmingham protests that I mentioned before convinced Kennedy that the United States could not portray itself as a champion of freedom anymore, and especially, while it was maintaining this system of racial inequality. And in June, he called for a law banning discrimination in all public accommodations, which is a major goal of the civil rights struggle. Now, I put the video of that speech online. It's a YouTube video, and it's very, very important because I think you'll be surprised and shocked at how serious and strong the language was that Kennedy used in that speech. And the YouTube clip I chose the YouTube clip deliberately because the clip is half of the clip is the news coverage of the speech, and it has the whole speech, right? Which please, whenever you want to see these speeches online, make sure you watch the entire speech if you can. But then the second half of that clip includes the journalist commentary. Okay, that's why I chose that clip, because that's the important thing to notice. Okay. But of course, Kennedy, as you know, died before the Civil Rights Bill was enacted. November 22nd, 1963, he's riding in a motorcade through Dallas and shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, troubled former Marine. And Oswald's assassination 2 days later by a local businessman has led to speculation about conspiracies unto this day, even though there's been not a shred of evidence that any of these conspiracies were actually true. Now, as you might imagine, Kennedy's death greatly shocked the nation, and Kennedy's delayed commitment to civil rights fell to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, and I'll have a lot to say about that in a minute. This is a picture of James Meredith, the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi, and he's in a classroom, and you can see that white students refused to sit anywhere near him. Okay, even white students who felt they were in sympathy with James Meredith and other protesters or other people trying to break the color line in the South were afraid just to show solidarity because they were often beaten up. Okay, the reaction against the civil rights movement in the United States, especially in the South, was absolutely vicious, just absolutely vicious. There's no other word. There's no way to mince words about this. It was inexcusable, and it was vicious, viciously full of hatred. Here is JFK and Jackie arriving at Love Field in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. The famous red roses that were in the car. They were in the car when the president was shot. And I've always liked, and I don't mean to say I like this picture because, of course, that was a tragedy, but this is a very good picture showing New York train passengers reading the news of President Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these are the afternoon newspapers of the day of November 22nd, 1963. In many cities, especially in New York, there were morning papers and afternoon papers. So there's a morning New York Herald, and there's an afternoon New York Herald, and the newspapers were able to get the news of the president's assassination into the afternoon papers, and this is why commuters on the train were reading about it, within hours of it happening after they were going home after work. Lots of places closed down and people went home early, but this was a shot of people going home from work at a five or six or seven at night and reading the newspapers. And it shows, of course, also there were lots of different newspapers, right? There also, sorry to keep going on about this, but some newspapers printed extra sort of supplements if they weren't a morning and afternoon paper, and you can see that commuter in the middle there is holding Kennedy. Oh, it's called a Kennedy Extra. That one of the newspapers had published. Okay, now let's look at the Lyndon Johnson presidency. And two things really can summarize the Lyndon Johnson presidency, and they are the Great Society and the Vietnam War. But for the moment, I want to talk about the Great Society. So the focus question, if we were to have one here, is what were the purposes and strategies of Johnson's Great Society programs? Now, unlike Kennedy, who came from a wealthy and powerful family and seemed to, he came from a wealthy and powerful family. LBJ grew up poor in an impoverished Texas hill country, and he struggled to achieve wealth and power. By the 1950s, however, he was the majority leader in the U.S. Senate, but he never forgot poor white and Mexican children he had taught in the 1930s. And more than Kennedy, he was committed to the New Deal social programs that assisted the less fortunate. He considered FDR his mentor. He was a huge supporter of FDR and wanted to emulate him in every way, in most ways. Now, one of the problems Johnson had was that he was from Texas, and he was from it was very difficult for him to push for civil rights in Congress when he was in Congress. Then, when he was vaulted to the presidency, he wasn't beholden to Texas voters anymore. So immediately upon taking office, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had championed. Okay, and now in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which barred discrimination in employment, barred discrimination in institutions such as hospitals and schools, and in privately owned accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It also banned discriminations on the grounds of sex, although this provision was added by opponents of civil rights who hoped to derail the bill and was embraced by liberal and female members of Congress. So Johnson knew that many whites opposed the law, and he feared that the South would turn Republican. Now, I've put a YouTube video of Johnson signing that bill in the module, and what's interesting about it, again, I put the long version of these videos on. You see Johnson making a statement about the bill, but then he goes on to sign the bill, and what doesn't happen anymore is that he signs the bill, but presidents back then used to sign it in this terribly complicated, well, not complicated, but lengthy way. They would sign the bill with 30 or 40 or sometimes 50 pens, so they would just make little marks of their signature with each pen, and then they turn and give that pen to a member of their party or a prominent member of the organization that's promoting whatever bill it was. And so it takes forever for Johnson, you see, to sign this bill. And he turns around, he hands a pen to Hubert Humphrey, who's a senator. He hands a pen to other members of Congress, right, who have been supporters of the bill. And he also eventually hands a pen to Martin Luther King. Now, later, when you'll see the video for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was far more important, he hands a pen to Martin Luther King sooner. Martin Luther King is sort of further up the list, but it is. I think it's always very interesting to see how these things are kind of handled. Sorry about that. Siri sort of seemed to want to speak up on my watch, so I had to push pause. Now, the 1964 law did not address blacks' rights to vote in the South. That summer, a coalition of civil rights groups started a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North traveled to take part in the campaign called the Freedom Summer. The violence against this campaign, however, was quick and deadly. It included bombings, beatings, the murder of 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The impetus for the famous Mississippi Burning movie. And although many black civil rights workers had been killed, it was the death of these 2 white youths that grabbed national attention and revealed, sort of federal indifference to violence against citizens claiming their rights. The Freedom Summer also led to dramatic campaign by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, to take seats of the state's all-white official party to the 1964 Democratic Convention. And that was a major move. Remember, the Democrats still controlled the South, and the Democrats in the South were overwhelmingly the party of racism and segregation in the South in 64. Okay. Now, because blacks were barred from democratic activities or registering to vote, the civil rights activists created that Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was open to all citizens. And Fannie Lou Hamer of the MFDP captivated the country in televised hearings in which she recounted her history of poverty and beatings by the police for civil rights works. LBJ feared that Southern Democrats would abandon the party if the MFDP delegates were seated, and the MFDP rejected a compromise to seat only 2 black delegates. So it was a very, very tense thing in 1964, the Democratic Convention in 1964. This was this is a picture of 2 students at a Freedom School in Mississippi in 1964. Freedom School was a sort of place where people got together and talked about how to work for civil rights. These were set up at different places all around the South, and they were often subject to tremendous abuse from segregationists and racists wherever they were. Okay. Now, as I said, the 1964 Democratic Convention it weakened blacks' faith that they could use the political system and foretold the break between the Democratic liberals and the civil rights movement. Okay. But the movement rallied behind Johnson's campaign for re-election. Johnson's Republican opponent was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, whose 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, sold more than 3 million copies. Goldwater demanded a more aggressive Cold War stance, but mostly he criticized the internal threats to freedom, especially the New Deal welfare state. He called for private charity to replace public welfare and Social Security, and for the abolition of the graduated income tax. Goldwater also voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but Democrats portrayed Goldwater as an extremist who would abolish Social Security and would risk nuclear war. And this helped Johnson win an overwhelming victory. Okay. And Democrats also took 2-to-1 majorities in both houses of Congress. But as might be implied by this Goldwater movement, the 1964 campaign also launched the modern conservative movement. Goldwater carried 5 deep South states, and George Wallace, who was the segregationist Democratic governor of Alabama, had done well in primaries in northern states such as Indiana and Wisconsin, which was key, which was showing a big split in the Democratic Party. Also in 1964, California voters approved Proposition 14, which repealed a 1963 law that banned racial discrimination in real estate sales, and this Proposition 14 was celebrated by conservatives as a move that would give white homeowners freedom against government interference. Okay. The Goldwater campaign and other stirrings showed that the 1960s also had this important conservative side. In 1960s, students inspired by conservative intellectual William F. Buckley gathered at his home in Sharon, Connecticut, and formed the Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF. The Young Americans for Freedom Sharon statement advocated the free market as a basis of personal freedom, limited government, and the destruction of global communism in the Cold War. YAF members became Goldwater's shock troops in the 1964 campaign, and he also found support in the suburbs of California and the Southwest, where immigrants from elsewhere in the United States had come to work in defense-related industries. These suburbanites were the base for later conservative insurgencies, and Goldwater's winning of 5 deep South states in 1964 also showed that Republicans might take advantage of white resentments against civil rights and move the South away from the Democrats. Although conservatives eventually abandoned the blatant language of racial superiority and inferiority, their calls for law and order and their stigmatization of welfare had strong racial overtones. Here's a billboard for Barry Goldwater in 1964. Right? Appealed to voters, in your heart you know he's right. Some people were reluctant to support him openly, but secretly agreed with his conservatism. And I don't know if you can see it, but at the bottom, some sort of protester or opponent of Goldwater put a banner at the bottom of this billboard, says yes, extreme right, meaning that Goldwater was on the extreme right of American politics. Okay, now here is a map showing the 1964 presidential election, huge landslide. Goldwater only got 52 electoral votes. Okay, that's the shocking sweep of the country by LBJ. These are segregationists in 1960. Okay, they were protesting against school integration in New Orleans, and this is an example of the white backlash that allowed Goldwater to carry that state in 1964. Now, Lyndon Johnson and reform is a very, very important aspect of this period of history. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama. Okay. Defying a ban by Governor Wallace, King tried to lead a march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. State police met the marchers with cattle prods, whips, and tear gas, and once more images of brutal police attacks on nonviolent demonstrators flashed on televisions worldwide. So the government was forced to take action, the federal government, and Johnson quickly asked Congress to pass a law securing the right to vote. So Congress soon enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters. Okay, so black Southerners finally regained the suffrage that they had been denied to them since the end of the 19th century. Okay. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution also outlawed the poll tax, which had prevented poor blacks and some whites from voting in the South. Okay. By 1965, the belief spread by a civil rights movement that racism could no longer create second-class citizens, and this affected other policy debates. In 1965, also, the Hart-Celler Act ended the national origins quota system of immigration that had excluded Asians and restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The law established a new racially neutral criteria for immigration, including family reunification and the demand for skills needed in America. Yet, because of growing hostility in the Southwest to Mexican immigration, the law for the first time sharply limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere, from within the Western Hemisphere, to 120,000 per year. This provision created the category of, quote, illegal aliens for migrants from elsewhere in the Americas. The law set the quota for the rest of the world at 170,000 per year, and exceptions for refugees from communist countries soon let immigration exceed those limits. Although immigrants were only 5% of the nation's population at the time,
here's what I found.
Sorry, Siri interrupted me in my watch, so I'll have to start that again. The law set the quota for the rest of the world at 170,000 per year, and exceptions for refugees from communist countries let immigration exceed the limits. Although immigrants were only 5% of the nation's population, at the time the reform caused a dramatic shift to Latin America, the Caribbean, and other sources of immigration. This is a picture of Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday, and Alabama State Police attacked voting rights advocates who planned to march from Selma to Montgomery. Okay, John Lewis, who was later a member of Congress from Georgia, and as I said, died just a couple years ago, is on the ground in the front. This is a picture of a sharecropper's shack in Alabama, right? This was alongside Jefferson Davis Highway. Of course, Jefferson Davis, the famous president of the Confederacy. This is a picture from 1965. Okay. Now notice, this is a log cabin in 1965. So these people's living conditions hadn't really improved in 100 years. I suppose the tin roofs were some kind of reform, but it's shocking. You know, there's no electricity here. There's no running water. And it's just shocking that by 1965, within my lifetime, Americans had to live like this. Okay. By the way, this is, I mentioned the Hart-Celler Act. This is LBJ signing that act with the Statue of Liberty in the background. Okay. Very, very important. The other thing about Johnson's program was promoting the general welfare. Okay. After that huge victory in 1964, Johnson outlined the most sweeping plan since the New Deal for government action to promote the general welfare. Johnson's programs of 65 to 67, known as the Great Society, provided health insurance to the poor and elderly with the new Medicaid and Medicare programs, and poured federal funds into education and urban development. New cabinet-level offices such as Department of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, and new agencies such as the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and a national public broadcasting network were all established. These measures greatly expanded the federal government's powers and completed and extended the social agenda, except for national health insurance that had stalled in Congress since 1938. Yet the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not depression. In the mid-60s, the economy was expanding, fueled by higher government spending and a tax cut passed in 1964 for individuals and businesses. Johnson and Democratic liberals believed that economic growth would fund more government programs and improve Americans' quality of life. The war on poverty, famous war on poverty, was the centerpiece of the Great Society. Launched in 1964, the effort was inspired in part by politicians' rediscovery of poverty amid 1950s affluence. Again, that picture of sharecroppers in Alabama is a perfect example. In 1962, Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America and showed that 50 million Americans still lived in poverty in rural and urban areas, okay? And that they had been removed from middle-class life and consciousness. Harrington showed that the mechanization of agriculture and the automation of industry had cut jobs for the unskilled. The civil rights movement highlighted the problem of poverty for blacks, but Harrington showed that the majority of the poor were actually white. Now, while Democrats during the New Deal had attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions, the Johnson administration believed poverty was caused by lack of skills, proper attitudes, and work habits. So the war on poverty, didn't directly fight poverty through efforts like but through efforts like work programs, spreading unions, and preventing businesses from moving production to the South or overseas. It did not address economic changes that reduced well-paid factory jobs and left the poor in rural and urban areas with few opportunities. Perhaps the most successful and popular program was food stamps, which is a form of direct aid. Okay. Johnson defended the Great Society in a New Deal language of freedom reinforced by the civil rights movement, recognizing that black poverty caused by past and present racism was different from white poverty. He tried to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. He argued that economic liberty was more than equal opportunity. But while Johnson's Great Society may not have achieved equality, it did reaffirm the idea of social citizenship. It was the greatest effort in American history to mobilize the powers of the federal government to aid less fortunate Americans, especially those like African Americans who've been excluded from original New Deal entitlements like Social Security, because, as I said before, those were handled at the state level and the states could sort of implement de facto discriminatory practices. This graph shows that during the 1960s, an expanding economy and growing government programs assisted the poor and produced a steady decrease in the percentage of Americans living in poverty. Okay? Not dramatic, but steady. And this is an interesting photograph. This is President Johnson visiting Appalachia, one of the poorest places in the United States. This is President Johnson visiting Appalachia in West Virginia as part of his war on poverty. This had also been part of the campaign in 1960 by the Kennedy people, right? And so you had lots of pictures of Democrats visiting the poor in Appalachia. This also means that the civil rights movement had to change in the 1960s. And so the focus question for here might be, how did that happen? How did the civil rights movement change from the way it had been run in the 1950s, early 50s and early 60s? Okay. You see, the civil rights movement entered a crisis when it moved from demanding access to schools, public facilities, and voting booths to addressing economic disparities between blacks and whites. In the mid-1960s, economic problems became a civil rights priority. Violence in northern ghettos brought attention to racial injustice and inequalities in jobs and education and housing, which the end of legal segregation didn't solve. The hostility of later race relations emerged from many whites' belief that blacks had won equality in civil rights and voting laws and needed no further assistance, while African Americans were aware of discrimination in jobs and education and housing and even in the criminal justice system called for more government action. The first riots, actually battles between blacks and mostly white police, erupted in Harlem in 1964. The larger uprisings of 1965 in Watts, the black ghetto of Los Angeles, saw 50,000 rioters attack police and firemen, loot white-owned businesses, and burn buildings. Now, after the National Guard restored order, 35 people had been killed, 900 injured, and $20 million in property destroyed. By the summer of 1967, urban riots seemed to be everywhere. Some feared racial war, frankly, and urban rebellions left 23 dead in Newark and 43 dead in Detroit, huge parts of which were devastated. Detroit, that is. Johnson appointed a commission to study the causes of urban disorder, whose report blamed them on segregation and poverty and indicted white racism and claimed that society was becoming harshly divided on racial lines. Okay. Here is a picture of residents watching as fires consume buildings in Detroit in the uprising of 1967, and this is the aftermath of the Watts uprising, right, in August of 1965. A very strange photograph in which you see all this devastation, yet a shoe shine man is able to sort of set up his stand and keep going. Also in the mid-60s, the mid-60s saw the rise of what you might call the Black Power movement. Well, I shouldn't say what was called the Black Power movement. Okay. If the early civil rights movement had clear objectives and profound accomplishments, the later movement saw political fragmentation and few victories. Even at the height of integration struggles, the incendiary orator Malcolm X insisted that African Americans must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and avoid working with whites. Okay. He was born in Malcolm Little. He committed several crimes as a youth, and he was converted to the Nation of Islam while he was in jail. Okay, and took the name Malcolm X. He dropped his slave surname in favor of X, symbolizing black separation from African ancestry. Now, when he was released from prison, Malcolm X became a spokesman for the Black Muslims, which is the Nation of Islam, and a vehement critic of the integrationism and nonviolence of the King and the Martin Luther King civil rights movement. Okay, unlike King, Malcolm X saw nothing redemptive in American values. Okay. So, and on a 1964 trip, for instance, to Mecca, Islam's spiritual center, Malcolm X saw that interracial harmony among Muslims was possible, and he moderated his message, embracing the possibility of interracial cooperation for a radical change in America. But his assassination in 1965 left no consistent ideology or organization behind. His calls for black independence inspired the urban poor and younger civil rights activists, and his 1966 autobiography became a bestseller. Now, Malcolm X was the father of Black Power, a slogan popularized by SNCC, the Southern Students for SNCC, Stokely Carmichael. The leader of the SNCC was Stokely Carmichael, the Southern Nonviolent Cooperation Committee. This was a phrase adopted in 1966 during a march in Mississippi. Black Power rallied those who were angry with the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights activists, while whites attempted to dominate the movement. And the movement's inability to influence the economic plight of urban blacks was a real problem. Black Power suggested everything from electing more black officials to political office to the belief that blacks were a colonized people whose freedom can only be won through revolutionary struggles for self-determination. The idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and inspired cultural pride. The word Negro was abandoned in favor of either black or Afro-American, and African dress and hairstyles were celebrated. Previously interracial civil rights groups like SNCC and CORE also repudiated their inclusion of whites, and they soon disintegrated. New groups sprang up, however, most prominently the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California in 1966 to protest police brutality. The Black Panthers won notoriety for advocating armed self-defense, and their militant stance and actions alarmed many moderate blacks and many whites. Okay. Troubled by internal disputes and police and FBI repression, the Black Panthers had more or less discriminated, and more or less disintegrated by the early 1970s. Now here's a picture of Malcolm X in 1962 distributing a newspaper publicizing charges against police brutality towards blacks. This is when he was really on the rise in black political consciousness. Okay. And this is a very, very important piece of art. This is an art installation by Betty Saar from 1972, and it was entitled The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. It illustrates modes of thought really associated with black power. Okay. The Quaker Oats Company had long used an image of a black woman reminiscent of the stereotypical slave mammy as a symbol for its brand of pancake mix and pancake syrup. Saar gave Aunt Jemima a rifle to go along with her broom. Okay. In front of her is another Aunt Jemima holding a light-skinned baby, according to the artist, which showed the sexual exploitation of black women by white men. Now, images in the background reveal how the Quaker Oats Company had already modified its advertising image, giving her a smaller handkerchief, a smaller kerchief, and an afro hairdo. But really, it wasn't until the 21st century that Aunt Jemima had more or less disappeared. And that shows you how long this struggle had been going on. I think Quaker Oats really only banned Aunt Jemima in 2018 or 2019.